The sun cast long shadows through the Ozark forest on the morning of July 26, 2025. It promised to be a beautiful day, the kind of day that Clinton and Kristen Brink had dreamed of when they decided to move their family to Arkansas. After years in the rugged, wide-open spaces of Montana, and before that the frenetic pace of California, the rolling hills and the slower pace of life in Prairie Grove felt like a welcome, gentle embrace. They had only been in their new home for a few weeks, a fresh start filled with the promise of being closer to Clinton's mother, whose health had been a growing concern, and raising their two young daughters, aged 7 and 9, surrounded by nature and family. The move was a deliberate choice, a conscious step away from the relentless demands of their previous lives towards something more grounded, more centered on family. Clinton, 43, was due to start a new job as a milk delivery driver for a local dairy. It wasn't a glamorous career, but for Clinton, a man who found profound joy in simple things, it was perfect. It offered stability, early mornings that would leave his afternoons free for his girls, and the chance to be a present and active father, a role he cherished above all else. He was a man of quiet strength, with a ready smile and a deep love for the outdoors, a passion he was eager to share with his children. Kristen, 41, a licensed nurse with years of experience in bustling emergency rooms, was looking forward to the change of pace. The high-stress environment of her previous jobs had taken its toll, and the prospect of a quieter life was a balm to her soul. For now, her focus was on settling the girls into their new school and creating a warm, loving home. She planned to eventually return to work, perhaps in a local clinic or a doctor's office, but for these first few months, her priority was her family's transition. Their new house, a modest but charming 2-story on a quiet, tree-lined street, was already filled with the sounds of their daughter's laughter. Boxes were still stacked in corners, waiting to be unpacked, but the house was already a home, filled with the warmth of their love for one another. That Saturday was a day for exploration, a day to create the first of many happy memories in their new home state. They had chosen Devil's Den State Park, a place of rugged beauty, its name a curious mix of the ominous and the alluring, with its ancient rock formations and winding trails. It was the perfect setting for a family adventure, a chance to immerse themselves in the natural wonder of their new surroundings. As the Brinks prepared for their hike, the familiar, happy chaos of a family morning filled their kitchen. The girls, buzzing with excitement, debated which snacks to bring, their high-pitched voices a symphony of youthful energy. Clinton patiently filled water bottles while Kristen packed sandwiches and fruit, the practiced, seamless teamwork of a long and happy marriage on full display. They were completely absorbed in their small, perfect world, oblivious to the fact that miles away, another man was also making his way towards the park, his intentions a dark stain on the bright summer day. Andrew James McGann, 28, was also new to Arkansas. He had recently moved from Oklahoma, having secured a teaching position at an elementary school in Springdale. On the surface, McGann was a man dedicated to the education of children. He had taught in both Oklahoma and Texas, and to the outside world he presented a carefully constructed facade of a charismatic and engaging teacher, the kind students adored. But beneath this veneer, there were unsettling undercurrents, a history of behavior that hinted at a deeply disturbed individual. During his time as a 4th-grade teacher at an elementary school in Flower Mound, Texas, a wealthy suburb of Dallas, serious concerns had been raised by parents. Whispers of inappropriate behavior, of grooming, and an unnerving favoritism towards certain young female students had circulated through the tight-knit community. He was known for giving select students gifts for engaging in one-on-one conversations that were deemed overly personal, and for creating an atmosphere of secrecy and special treatment that made many parents deeply uncomfortable. An investigation had been launched by the school district, and though no criminal charges were ultimately filed due to a lack of concrete evidence, The cloud of suspicion was enough. McGann was placed on administrative leave before he quietly resigned, moving on to another school in another state, leaving a trail of unease in his wake. He had a history of unsettling behavior that seemed to follow him from one teaching post to the next, a trail of red flags that went unheeded, dismissed as oddities rather than the warning signs they truly were. Now, as he drove his black sedan towards Devil's Den, the license plate on his vehicle deliberately obscured by a layer of dark tape, a cold and calculated darkness was brewing within him, a stark contrast to the brilliant sunshine of the summer day. The Brink family arrived at the park, their minivan pulling into a space near the trailhead. The girls, freed from the confines of the car, immediately took off, their laughter echoing through the trees as they set off on the Yellow Rock Trail. It was a popular route, known for its stunning overlook of the Lee Creek Valley, a reward for the moderate climb. The trail was a 3-mile loop, a perfect challenge for a family with young children. The first part of the hike was an ascent through a narrow gorge, the path winding between impressive sandstone bluffs and shallow caves, their cool, damp air a welcome respite from the growing heat. The girls, full of boundless energy and excitement, ran ahead, their bright t-shirts flashes of color against the green and brown of the forest. They'd pause to examine an interesting rock or a scurrying lizard, their voices calling back to their parents, "Mom, Dad, come see." Clinton and Kristen followed closely behind, their hands clasped together, their faces lit with the quiet joy of watching their children experience the wonders of nature. They were a picture of familial bliss, a young family embarking on a new chapter of their lives, completely unaware that their path was about to tragically intersect with a predator. As they made their way up the trail, they were unknowingly on a collision course with Andrew James McGann, a man whose own path was one of escalating darkness and barely concealed rage. The beauty of the Ozark forest, with its dappled sunlight and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind, held no solace for the storm that was about to break. The day that had begun with such promise, filled with laughter and the simple joy of being together, was about to descend into a nightmare from which there would be no waking. The forest floor was a tapestry of dappled sunlight and deep, cool shadows. The Brink family had fallen into a comfortable rhythm on their ascent, the initial burst of the girls' energy settling into a steady pace. They were nearing the summit of the Yellow Rock Trail, a point promising a panoramic reward for their efforts. The air grew thinner, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Clinton pointed out a hawk circling high above the valley, its wings spread wide against the brilliant blue sky. His daughters watched in awe, their small faces tilted upwards. Kristen squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of the perfect moment. This was it. This was the life they had chosen, a life measured in shared smiles and quiet wonders. They were completely and utterly happy, blissfully unaware that they were being watched. From a vantage point slightly off the main trail, hidden by a thicket of brush and the trunk of an ancient oak, Andrew James McGann observed them. He had first spotted the family about a half-mile back, their bright clothing and the sound of childish laughter cutting through the serene quiet of the woods. He had been walking aimlessly, his mind a maelstrom of resentment and self-pity, when the sight of them had snagged his attention. He saw not a family, but a perfect, mocking portrait of everything he had been denied. He saw the easy affection between the husband and wife, the way the father swung his younger daughter into the air, the mother's gentle hand on her older child's shoulder. It was a scene of such effortless love and belonging that it felt like a personal affront, a deliberate showcase of all the gaping holes in his own life. His own childhood had been a sterile affair, marked by emotional distance and the relentless pressure to achieve. Love was conditional, affection was a reward, not a given. And his recent professional life had been a series of humiliating failures. The accusations in Texas, though never proven in a court of law, had been a death sentence to his reputation, a brand of shame that had followed him to Oklahoma and now to Arkansas. He saw himself as a victim, a man misunderstood, punished for simply trying to connect with his students, to be the caring mentor he never had. In his twisted perception, the world was aligned against him, and this family, in their simple, radiant happiness, was the ultimate symbol of that injustice. A cold, hard knot of rage began to form in his stomach, a feeling that was both terrifying and exhilarating. He began to follow them. His movements were fluid and silent, a predator stalking its prey. He kept a careful distance, using the natural contours of the land and the dense foliage for cover. When they paused, he froze, melting into the shadows. When they moved, he moved with them, a silent, malevolent echo. The sounds of their happiness, which had initially been an irritant, now became a focusing point for his hatred. Each peal of laughter from the little girls was like a turn of a screw in his tightening mind. He noted the way Clinton put a protective arm around Kristen as they navigated a rocky patch of trail. He saw the absolute trust in the children's eyes as they looked at their parents. It was a world he could never enter, a fortress of love and security he was determined to breach. The Brink family reached the Yellow Rock Overlook. The trail opened up onto a large, flat rock formation, offering a breathtaking, unobstructed view of the Lee Creek Valley below. The forest canopy spread out like a vast green ocean, the creek a silver ribbon winding through its depths. "Wow," Kristen breathed, stepping towards the edge. The girls, momentarily forgetting their tired legs, ran to join her, their voices filled with wonder. Clinton stood back for a moment, capturing the scene with his phone, a digital memory of a perfect day. They were alone, suspended between the sky and the earth, a tiny island of humanity in a sea of wilderness. For a few precious minutes, they stood there, taking in the beauty, completely vulnerable. That was when Andrew McGann chose to reveal himself. He didn't rush out from the trees. He simply stepped onto the overlook from the trail, as any other hiker might. He was dressed in nondescript hiking clothes, a small backpack slung over his shoulders. He even managed a thin, rehearsed smile as he approached. "Quite a view, isn't it?" he said, his voice calm, almost friendly. Clinton lowered his phone and nodded, returning the smile with genuine warmth. "It's incredible. Our first time here?" Kristen instinctively pulled the girls a little closer, a subconscious act of motherly protection in the presence of a stranger. But she too offered a polite nod. There was a flicker of something in the man's eyes, a cold intensity that seemed out of place with his casual demeanor, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "You have a beautiful family," McGann said, his gaze lingering on the two young girls for a fraction of a second too long. A prickle of unease ran down Kristen's spine. Clinton, ever friendly, simply replied, "Thank you. We're very lucky." It was that word lucky that seemed to break the fragile peace. The man's smile vanished, replaced by a chillingly blank expression. His hand moved to his backpack, not with the casual motion of a hiker reaching for a water bottle, but with a swift, deliberate purpose. Before Clinton or Kristen could fully process the shift in his demeanor, he pulled out a handgun. The metallic click of the safety being disengaged was unnervingly loud in the quiet air. The world seemed to slow down. Kristen's mind reeled, unable to connect the stunning beauty of their surroundings with the ugly reality of the weapon pointed at them. Clinton's face hardened, his friendly demeanor vanishing as his body tensed, instinctively positioning himself between the man and his family. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and steady, a stark contrast to the frantic pounding of his heart. McGann didn't answer immediately. He seemed to be savoring their fear, his eyes darting from the terrified parents to the bewildered children. "Everything you have," he finally whispered, his voice raspy with a hatred that was terrifying in its intensity. And then he lunged, not towards the children, but towards Clinton, the protector. The struggle began in an instant, a desperate, violent explosion on the sun-drenched cliff top. The girl's first terrified screams swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the valley below. The serene beauty of the overlook shattered in an instant. The gunshot was a deafening crack that seemed to rip a hole in the fabric of the peaceful afternoon. It echoed across the valley, a sound of profound and irreversible violence. Clinton, driven by pure adrenaline and a primal need to protect his family, had lunged at McGann, his hands reaching for the gun. He was a strong man, his body hardened by years of physical work. But McGann was fueled by a cold, simmering rage that gave him a terrifying, almost inhuman strength. The struggle was a desperate, chaotic blur of motion on the edge of the cliff. Grunts, the thud of bodies colliding, the frantic scrabbling of shoes on rock. Kristen screamed, a raw, ragged sound torn from the depths of her soul. Her mind, trained to assess and react in medical emergencies, was now paralyzed by a horror for which there was no training. For a split second, she was frozen, her world contracting to the image of her husband fighting for his life, for their lives. Then, her maternal instinct took over, a force more powerful than her fear. "Girls, run! Go! Get back down the trail!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. She gave her daughters a hard shove, trying to propel them away from the violence, away from the man who had turned their perfect day into a living hell. But the girls were frozen too, their small bodies rigid with a terror they couldn't possibly comprehend. They could only watch, their eyes wide with disbelief, as their father, their hero, fought the monster on the cliff. Clinton managed to land a solid blow, staggering McGann, and for a fleeting moment, there was a glimmer of hope. But McGann recovered quickly, his face a mask of fury. He brought the butt of the handgun down hard on the side of Clinton's head. The sickening thud was followed by a gasp as Clinton stumbled backward, his strength failing him. McGann didn't hesitate. He raised the gun again, the barrel just inches from Clinton's chest, and fired. The second shot was just as loud, but this time, it was followed by a terrible silence. Clinton staggered back another step, a look of profound shock and love on his face as his eyes found Kristen's. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then, his body, which had been a bastion of strength and safety just moments before, simply crumpled to the ground. He fell onto the hard, sun-warmed rock of the overlook, the life fading from his eyes before he even came to a rest. The hawk continued to circle lazily in the sky above, oblivious to the tragedy that had just unfolded below. Kristen's world collapsed into a single point of unbearable agony. A keening wail escaped her lips, a sound of pure, undiluted grief. But there was no time to mourn, no time to process the impossible reality of her husband lying dead at her feet. McGann was already turning towards her, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a triumphant, terrifying light. He was in control now. The brief, violent struggle had cemented his power. "Not a sound," he hissed, the gun now pointed directly at her. Kristen fell to her knees, instinctively shielding her daughters who were now sobbing uncontrollably, their small hands clutching at her legs. "Please," she begged, her voice a raw whisper. "Please, just take whatever you want. Our car keys, my purse, anything. Just please. Don't hurt my babies. Please. They're just children." She was no longer a nurse, no longer a wife. She was only a mother, pleading for the lives of her young. She looked into McGann's eyes and saw nothing. No pity, no remorse, no flicker of humanity. She saw only a cold, empty void. "Get up," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He gestured with the gun away from the trail towards the dense, unforgiving woods that bordered the overlook. "We're going for a walk?" The command was so absurd, so grotesquely normal, that for a moment Kristen couldn't comprehend it. But the unwavering aim of the gun was a clear and brutal translator. He wasn't going to let them go. He wasn't a robber. He was something far, far worse. With trembling legs, Kristen rose to her feet. "Mommy, I'm scared," her younger daughter cried, her face buried in Kristen's side. "I know, baby, I know. Just stay close to me," Kristen whispered, her own terror a lead weight in her stomach. She held her daughter's hands, her grip a lifeline in a world that had suddenly turned dark and treacherous. She took one last agonizing look at Clinton's still form, her heart shattering into a million pieces. Then, under the cold, watchful eye of their captor, she led her children off the path, away from the sunlit overlook and into the deep, encroaching shadows of the forest. The journey was a nightmare. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. McGann walked behind them, his presence a constant, menacing pressure at their backs. He directed them with curt, cruel words, pushing them deeper and deeper into the wilderness, far from any trail where they might be discovered. The girls stumbled over roots and rocks, their small legs struggling to keep up. Kristen tried to soothe them with whispered words of comfort, lies that felt like ash in her mouth. "It's going to be okay," she repeated over and over, a desperate mantra against the encroaching darkness. But she knew it wasn't true. She knew they were walking towards an unimaginable end, and the only question left was whether she could somehow, in some impossible way, save her children from the fate that had already claimed their father. After what felt like an eternity, McGann finally called a halt in a small, secluded clearing, far from any prying eyes. "Stop here," he said. Kristen turned to face him, her body trembling, her mind racing, searching for an escape that didn't exist. "What are you going to do to us?" she asked, her voice barely audible. McGann offered a cruel, thin smile. "First," he said, raising the gun and pointing it directly at her heart, "we're going to make sure the children are alone." The cruel smile on Andrew McGann's face was the last thing Kristen Brink saw with any clarity. In that final, horrifying moment, her mind, a maelstrom of terror and grief, focused on a single, impossible task: how to save her children. She knew she was going to die. There was no bargaining, no appeal to a humanity that simply wasn't there. She saw it in the deadness of his eyes. All she had left was one last, desperate act of a mother's love. "Look at me," she said, her voice surprisingly firm, her gaze locking onto her two daughters. "Girls, look at Mommy. Close your eyes and think of Daddy. Think of him swinging you on the porch swing. Think of his laugh." She was trying to shield them, to give them one last happy image to cling to before their world was irrevocably destroyed. She was trying to spare them the sight of what was to come. Her older daughter, her face a pale mask of terror, squeezed her eyes shut, tears streaming down her cheeks. The younger one, however, was too paralyzed by fear to do anything but stare, her thumb instinctively going to her mouth. McGann found this final act of defiance infuriating. It was another example of the familial bond he so despised. "Touching," he sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He didn't give her another moment. The gun fired. The sound was flat and final in the small clearing, absorbed by the dense foliage around them. Kristen's body was thrown backward, as if by an invisible force. She fell without a sound, her eyes, which had been so full of love and fight, now vacant. She landed on a bed of last year's fallen leaves, her life extinguished in an instant. For a long moment, there was no sound at all, except for the gentle rustle of the wind in the treetops. The two little girls stood as if turned to stone, their mother's last words hanging in the air. The older sister slowly opened her eyes, her mind refusing to process the scene before her. Her mommy was sleeping on the leaves. That's what her child's brain told her. But she wasn't sleeping. She was too still. A single dark red flower was blooming on the front of her shirt. The younger girl let out a small, choked sob, a sound that seemed to break the spell. The older sister, 9 years old but suddenly aged a lifetime, wrapped a protective arm around her. "Shh," she whispered, her own voice trembling. "Mommy said to think of Daddy." It was an act of incredible bravery, a tiny flickering candle of love in an overwhelming darkness. She was trying to follow her mother's last instruction, to protect her little sister in the only way she knew how. Andrew McGann watched them, a dispassionate observer to the trauma he had just inflicted. He felt a surge of power, a heady sense of control that was more intoxicating than any drug. He had destroyed them. He had taken their perfect world and smashed it into a million pieces. He looked at the two children huddled together, their small bodies shaking, and he felt nothing. No remorse, no pity. They were simply loose ends, complications to be managed. He let the silence stretch out for another minute, allowing the full weight of their new reality to crush them. Then he moved. "Come on," he said, his voice jarringly normal. "It's time to go." The girls didn't move. They were rooted to the spot, their eyes fixed on their mother's body. McGann's patience, always a thin veneer over his rage, began to fray. He took a step forward and grabbed the older girl by the arm, his grip hard and unforgiving. "I said, it's time to go." The girl flinched but didn't cry out. She had seen what this man could do. She knew that defiance was useless. With her other hand, she held tightly to her sister, pulling her along. McGann led them away from the clearing, back through the woods. He didn't look back at the bodies of Clinton and Kristen Brink, left to the silence of the forest. They were no longer of any concern to him. The walk back to the trail was a blur of numb terror for the children. They moved like automatons, their minds shut down, their bodies simply following the path of least resistance. The forest, which had seemed so magical and full of adventure just an hour ago, was now a place of menacing shadows and unseen threats. Every sound was amplified, every rustle of a leaf a potential new horror. McGann kept a tight grip on the older girl's arm, his knuckles white. When they reached the main trail, it was thankfully empty. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, and most of the day hikers had already made their descent. "Not a word," McGann hissed, his face close to the girl's ear. "You don't talk, you don't look at anyone, you just walk. Do you understand me?" The girl gave a small, jerky nod. She understood all too well. This man held their lives in his hands, and he had already proven he had no qualms about ending them. The rest of the descent was made in agonizing silence. They passed one other couple heading up the trail, who offered them a friendly hello. McGann nodded curtly in response, tightening his grip on the girl's arm as a warning. The children kept their eyes fixed on the ground in front of them, their faces pale and tear-streaked. To the casual observer, they might have looked like a father taking his tired and grumpy children home after a long hike. The reality was a nightmare hidden in plain sight. They finally reached the parking lot. McGann led them not to the Brinks minivan, but to his own black sedan parked in a more remote corner of the lot. He opened the back door and pushed them inside, his movements rough and impatient. He got into the driver's seat, started the engine, and pulled out of the parking lot, leaving Devil's Den State Park behind. The car was silent as they drove, the two sisters huddled together in the back seat, a small island of shared grief in a sea of terror. They were alone, captives of the man who had murdered their parents, being driven towards an unknown and terrifying destination. The world outside the car windows continued on as normal, but for the Brink sisters, life as they knew it was over. The black sedan was a silent, moving prison. The world outside the window seemed impossibly normal. Cars passed them going the other way, their occupants oblivious to the two terrified children in the back seat. A billboard advertised a local barbecue restaurant. A family was getting out of their car at a gas station laughing. For the Brink sisters, it was like watching a movie of a life that no longer existed for them. They huddled together, the older sister's arm wrapped tightly around the younger one's shoulders. The grief was a physical weight, a crushing presence in the small space. But it was overshadowed by the chilling reality of the man in the front seat. Andrew McGann drove with a calm, focused intensity. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't speak. He just drove, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The adrenaline from the murders had subsided, replaced by a cold, methodical clarity. He was no longer the enraged man on the cliff. He was a problem solver. And the two children in his back seat were the primary problem he needed to solve. He had thought this through, not in a detailed, step-by-step plan, but in the abstract daydreams of his darkest fantasies. He had always known that if he ever crossed the line, there would be complications. Now he was living in the reality of those complications. He avoided major highways, sticking to a winding network of rural county roads that snaked through the Ozark countryside. He passed dilapidated barns, fields of grazing cattle, and dense patches of woodland. The landscape grew more and more remote with each passing mile. He was heading towards a place he had found weeks earlier during his explorations of his new home state. It was an old, abandoned farmhouse, set far back from a little-used dirt road, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. The roof was caving in, the windows were boarded up, and a no trespassing sign, riddled with bullet holes, was nailed crookedly to a rotting fence post. It was a place of decay and forgotten things, the perfect place to hide a terrible secret. When he finally turned onto the dirt track, the car bumping and lurching over the uneven ground, the older sister felt a fresh wave of fear. This was it. This was the place he was taking them. The house came into view, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening afternoon sky. It looked like a haunted house from a scary movie, but this was real. McGann parked the car behind the dilapidated structure, out of sight from the road. He got out and opened the back door. "Out," he said, his voice flat. He led them towards a small, sturdy-looking storm cellar set into the ground a few yards from the main house. The wooden doors were heavy and secured with a thick, rusted chain. He produced a key from his pocket and unlocked the padlock. With a grunt of effort, he pulled the heavy doors open, revealing a set of steep concrete steps leading down into absolute darkness. A damp, musty smell, like rotting leaves and cold earth, wafted up from the opening. "Get down there," he ordered. The younger sister began to cry again, a high, thin wail of pure terror. "I don't want to go in the dark," she sobbed, burying her face in her sister's side. The older girl, her own heart hammering against her ribs, stood her ground for a moment. "There's nothing down there," she said, her voice small but clear. McGann looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes at her defiance. He then reached out and grabbed the younger girl, pulling her away from her sister. "You can go down together, or she can go down alone. It's up to you," he said, his voice a low threat. The choice was no choice at all. The older sister took a deep breath, her small shoulders squared, with a resolve that was far beyond her years. "Okay," she whispered. "We'll go." She took her sister's hand, and step by terrifying step led her down into the cold, black cellar. It was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with damp concrete walls and a packed earth floor. The air was thick and hard to breathe. McGann followed them down, carrying a single plastic gallon of water and a box of granola bars, which he set on the floor. "Don't cause any trouble," he said. It was an unnecessary command. He then turned and went back up the steps. The last thing they saw was his silhouette blocking out the fading light. Then, the heavy wooden doors slammed shut, plunging them into a complete and total darkness. The sound of the chain being rattled into place, the final metallic click of the padlock, was the sound of their hope being extinguished. They were trapped. They were alone in the dark with the ghosts of what had happened just a few hours before. The younger sister's cries turned into shuddering sobs. The older sister held her close, whispering the only comforting words she could think of. "It's okay. Mommy and Daddy will find us soon." It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. But it was all she had. In the cold, damp darkness of the cellar, a 9-year-old girl held her 7-year-old sister and tried to keep the monsters at bay, unaware that the real monster was sitting just a few feet above them, deciding what to do with them next. The sun set, and the long, terrible night began. The darkness in the storm cellar was absolute. It was a thick, heavy blanket that swallowed sound and erased the world. For the two Brink sisters, time ceased to have meaning. It was measured only in the growing ache of hunger, the chilling dampness that seeped up from the earthen floor, and the terrifying sounds of the world above. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every rustle of leaves in the wind, was the monster coming back for them. The younger girl cried for long stretches, her sobs eventually tapering off into exhausted, hitching breaths. The older sister, a child forced into a role no one should ever have to assume, held her, murmuring reassurances she didn't feel herself. She carefully rationed the granola bars, breaking one into 4 small pieces to make it last. She unscrewed the cap on the water jug, helping her sister drink in the suffocating darkness. She told her stories, whispering tales of princesses and magical animals, her voice a fragile shield against the terror that surrounded them. She was her mother's daughter, her father's strength, a 9-year-old warrior armed only with love. Meanwhile, the world outside the cellar had begun to notice the silence. Clinton's mother, who had been expecting a call from them Sunday morning to hear all about their adventure, felt a growing knot of unease as the day wore on with no word. By Sunday evening, her calls to both Clinton's and Kristen's phones went straight to voicemail. It wasn't like them. It wasn't like them at all. She called the local police department, her voice trembling, to report her son, her daughter-in-law, and her 2 granddaughters missing. The initial response was measured. Families sometimes lost track of time, especially on weekend outings. But when a park ranger at Devil's Den confirmed their minivan was still in the parking lot on Monday morning, the situation escalated dramatically. A full-scale search and rescue operation was launched. Dozens of volunteers and law enforcement officers fanned out across the park's rugged terrain. They called out the families' names, their voices echoing through the valleys, answered only by the chirping of birds. The initial theory was a tragic hiking accident. Perhaps they had wandered off the trail and become lost, or someone had fallen. The search teams focused on the Yellow Rock Trail, the route they had planned to take. Late Monday afternoon, a searcher near the overlook spotted something that didn't belong, a splash of color on the rocks. It was Clinton. The discovery sent a shockwave through the search party. This was no longer a rescue mission. It was a crime scene. The area was immediately sealed off, and the search became more meticulous, more grim. A few hours later, following a faint trail of disturbed leaves and broken twigs leading away from the overlook, they found Kristen. The investigation now moved with fierce urgency. They were hunting a killer who had abducted two small children. The media descended on the park, broadcasting the girls' smiling school pictures to a horrified public. An appeal was made for anyone who had been hiking in the park on Saturday to come forward. That appeal yielded the one crucial break they needed. A couple, who had been on a late afternoon hike, remembered seeing a man walking down the trail with two young girls. They remembered it because the girls looked so utterly miserable, their faces pale and tear-streaked. They thought it was just a case of a father who had pushed his kids too far on a long hike. The man, they said, had a cold, intense look about him. They worked with a forensic artist, and by Tuesday morning, a composite sketch was being blasted across every news channel and social media feed in the state. The call came in just a few hours later. It was from a principal at an elementary school in Springdale. The sketch, she said with a chilling certainty, looked exactly like a new teacher they had just hired, a man named Andrew James McGann. He had called in sick on Monday and Tuesday. Within minutes, the police had his address, his vehicle description, and his photo. His history began to unspool with horrifying speed. The accusations in Texas, the sudden resignation, the transient lifestyle. He was no longer a person of interest. He was the prime suspect. A tactical team descended on his apartment, but it was empty. A search of his laptop, however, revealed recent internet searches for abandoned properties in Washington County and satellite images of a derelict farmhouse on a remote dirt road. The convoy of police cruisers and unmarked cars moved silently through the rural roads, kicking up dust as they converged on the location. They found the black sedan parked behind the decrepit house, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The house itself was empty, but as they swept the property, one of the officers noticed the heavy wooden doors of the storm cellar. He knelt down, his ear close to the wood, and listened. He heard something, a faint, muffled sound. It was the sound of a child's whimper. With a pry bar, they forced the padlock. The chain fell away and they heaved the heavy doors open. Light flooded the dark space for the first time in nearly 2 days. An officer shone his powerful flashlight down the steps. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on two small figures huddled in the far corner. They were pale, thin, and terrified, blinking in the sudden blinding light. The older sister had her arm wrapped protectively around the younger, her body shielding her sister even in this final moment of rescue. Andrew McGann was found less than an hour later, walking along a highway a few miles away. He had seen the police arrive and had fled into the woods, but there was nowhere for him to go. He surrendered without a fight, his brief and brutal reign of terror over. He was a small, pathetic figure on the side of the road, stripped of the power and control he had so desperately craved. Back at the farmhouse, a paramedic gently lifted the younger girl into her arms, while a female officer knelt down in front of the older sister. "You're safe now," she said softly. "You were so brave. You saved your sister." The girl didn't speak. She just looked at the officer, her eyes, ancient and haunted, filled with a grief and a resilience that no 9-year-old should ever have to know. Wrapped in warm blankets and finally safe, the two sisters were driven away from the house of horrors, leaving the darkness behind them. A long and difficult road ahead, but a road they would walk together. If this story moved you, please don't forget to hit the like button and share it with others. Your support helps us bring more real, impactful stories like this to light. Subscribe to The Witness Record for more in-depth true crime investigations, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an update. Your voice matters, and your awareness could help bring justice to those who need it the most. Thank you for being part of the journey.